Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show one project for using leftover thread scraps. These are the threads that remain on your needle after you finish a project. They can be just a couple of inches long or longer. It's just the little scrap that you no longer need. I set them aside and stick them in a jar, and then every so often, when I have a bunch of them, I'll sort them by color because I tend to group them into color families. And then from there, I'll stitch them into my projects. I have a previous video where I made a shape with the ORT. But for this project, we're going to make a freestanding bead. And here's my process. So here I have my jar of ORTs or threadlings, just the leftover thread from when I'm creating a stitching project. It's just the little snips that remain on the needle that I'm no longer using. Here I've already rolled them into the little balls that I use. And here I've strung one just on some embroidery floss, and I added some buttons and a little bell, and it could be like a little book charm that I'll eventually stitch into my fabric book, and it'll just be a little dangling piece. So that's one thing you can do with them. So to do this, you can either just grab a little handful of the scraps and use them as it is, and you'll get a very colorful ball. I tend to sort them into color families because I like the way that looks. And for today's video, we're going to do yellows and oranges. So I'll just pull out some of those and set them aside. So that's more or less a nice little pile here. I don't need quite this many, and it will vary depending on what size ball you want to make. I just want a little one, so I'll just use about half of these. So the first thing I do is I kind of just roll it, taking the longer strands and rolling them around just to make a tight little ball here. From there, I take one strand of embroidery floss that's about 18 inches long, and I just wrap a few times around, and this kind of just holds my piece together. I'm not trying to wrap so tight that it squeezes or condenses the threads, but I just want it to hold it in place in certain areas. And then from there, I'll just take some embroidery floss on a needle, and this is just 2 strands of embroidery floss, but you can use any thickness you want. And I'm just going to sew up through that needle, making a stitch. My tail will stick out. And then I'll wrap that around twice, and then I'll come back in at a different angle. And I'm just going to do this, wrapping it around once and then stitching through again and again until I've used up my thread and until that ball becomes a little more substantial, kind of holds itself in place. Now, as I can see, it's really starting to come together already. I just want to go down in the middle now. Don't even have to wrap it anymore. Just coming out one end and up the other. And you do this until you acquire the shape that you want with this ball of threadlings. So I'll just do a couple more stitches because that's all the room I have left on this strand. And I'll just come in here and knot it off at one point. Now I'll clip the end, and I can take a look at my piece. It's not quite perfectly round. So I'll get another piece of embroidery floss on my needle and do a few more stitches. So now I have another strand of embroidery floss, and this is all 6 strands on a needle. And again, I'm just going to come in from one side, make my first stitch, and then just wrap it around. And every time I wrap it around, I'm trying to emphasize the shape that I want as an end result. So I'll pull that thread through, and then I'll just take a look at my piece. I see I need to pull this through. And I just keep going to all the different ends and the sides until I start to have that shape. And because I want this one to be a nice rounded shape, I'll just come in from the different angles until it pulls that shape together. Come back out here, go in here until I'm happy with that. Now you can use a contrasting thread. You could start stringing beads onto your thread, and then you'd have a beaded fabric bead when you're done. But once it starts to create the shape you like, and you'll notice that it gets a lot harder, a lot more substantial, you can just make your final stitch and knot it off. So I'll do that, make my final little stitch over here. Then I'll knot off the piece, and then I'll just trim off any of these little sections that remain, any of these strands that stick out. I can take this little thread and add it to my stash of old threadlings, put it back in the bucket, and then I'll just compress this just to make sure it has that nice rounded shape that I'm looking for. And then once I'm happy with it, I'll put it in a jar and save with my other little threadling balls. And then I have a great way to use some of my ORTs. So that's one way of using up your leftover threads to create that bead. Depending on the size of the bead you want, the number of threads you have, you can make a really large bead or just smaller ones, or even a series of graduated sizes. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.